Welcome to the delightfully unconventional world of Holding Up the Queue. This irregular, irreverent podcast explores esoteric ways of thinking, the magic of storytelling, and some unexpected corners of creativity, taking the Harlequinade as the wellspring of some unusual and fascinating themes. Welcome back to part 2 of Holding Up the Queue, and my guests today are Christopher Oram, award-winning set designer and costume designer, and Brian Selznick, award-winning writer and book illustrator. In the last episode, you might want to go back and listen because we talked to Brian about his influences, and there's lots of different elements that you might like and might make sense when we catch up in this part 2 with Christopher Oram. So if we start now with you, Christopher.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for coming in. I'm just going to say, because now if you haven't heard the first part, you will suddenly think, who's that? Because there are 3 of us talking, as I've just said, Brian and Christopher. But you are both friends, aren't you?
We are.
This is the freakiest thing. So tell the listeners how you both know each other.
We met through John Logan, who wrote the screenplay for Hugo and who wrote the play Red, for which John and Christopher and Christopher's partner Michael all won Tony Awards and various other awards, some Oliviers. And we met, I think, while Hugo was being written and Red was up.
We also met through Paul Keeve as well.
And Paul Keeve, yes, that's right. Paul Keeve was the magician on Hugo, who I never know what to say. The magic man. So Paul introduced us because you and Paul had worked together a long time ago.
Yeah. Right, because you do have. This is where I'm going to get a bit all starry for my listeners. But between you, it was really difficult to choose. Sort of the introduction for me was a nightmare because it's how do I sort of bring in Christopher's accolades and how do I bring in Brian's accolades? You have between you so many, and they are all incredibly interesting, that I ended up wheelbarrowing them up Charing Cross Road and I dumped them because I was doing my back in. So you're going to have to go back and get them a bit later. So like as I said in the first one, when we introduced them initially, we're very privileged. This is a really, really big privilege for us to have you both in and talk to you both at the same time. And it's lovely, the fact that we can dip in and out and that you're friends and there'll be no fighting. I don't know about the rest of the people in the queue behind you, but there'll be no fighting. So if I start with you now, Christopher, can you please tell us the Star Wars story?
From the beginning?
Yes, actually I do want it from the beginning.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
In a galaxy far away.
Yeah.
Well, it was. The 70s was a long time ago, and it was a galaxy far, far away.
And it was a different time.
It was a very different time, and there was definitely a time before Star Wars, and it was browner and greyer and strikier, and it was dry because it was the summer of 76. And I was 9, so I was kind of very young, and one afternoon, went with my friend Simon, and his dad took us to Brighton ABC.
Not me, I have to say.
No time. And we watched this movie, and it just was unlike anything I'd ever seen or experienced before in my life, and it was just blew my mind right from the opening shot, which was obviously what the opening shot of Star Wars is supposed to do, but it absolutely hooked me at the exact age that I was ready to be hooked, sort of thing. And it changed everything I thought about what I wanted to do and where I wanted to be with my life, which is obviously initially flying a spaceship, and then it was kind of perhaps then kind of making spaceships to fly, and then perhaps it was just making films about spaceships.
Right.
But it was that sort of pushed me into this line of work.
But it was an epiphany, wasn't it? It's that thing that people I think sort of underestimate children, that they do have epiphanies.
Yeah.
And that these things which are around, which are popular culture, which at certain times in one's life or a certain kind of person could sneer at, have an incredibly powerful effect on individuals who then go on to have a powerful effect on others.
Yeah, that's the thing. And it took me on a journey. I'm nowhere near it anymore. Well, actually, no, I am suddenly, because now I'm working for Disney, and Disney now owns Star Wars. So ironically, it's sort of almost come full circle. But I never achieved my goal at that time to have worked on those movies. In fact, I wasn't ultimately interested in movies, I became interested in theatre.
Right. Because that's what I was going to say. Because you said obviously it was a spaceship thing first of all, and then you can't have a spaceship.
Well, it was a spaceship. It was alien worlds. It was creating alien worlds. It was in the genius of Star Wars is this entirely believable landscapes and entirely believable planets and towns and cities and vehicles and stuff like that. And it was an entirely invented world. That's what's so wonderful about it. It's like, there's nothing normal apart from the two weird power generators in the docking bay. But other than that,
because I think the interesting thing is, if we look at it from almost like a sort of theatrical point of view, the scenes change. I'm sure they do in the first one, because they do in the later ones, where it's almost like a sort of curtain goes across the film, doesn't it?
Yeah, the wipes.
And is that what's called the wipes? I mean, seeing that was that used for the first time, do you think, in that
Oh, no, not at all. But no. It was a very old-fashioned way of doing it, and Lucas was kind of reviving that as an idea of making it feel more epic. It was sort of doing the slow wipes across and sort of bleeding from one location to another.
But also for children watching it, I remember, like I say, if we go back to the thing of like being a certain kind of child and being interested in certain kinds of things, I remember there was no Holly Hobby in it. There's nothing like that. I wasn't really interested in space and sci-fi and things like that. I was much more gothic, old-fashioned, romantic fairy tale sort of things, ghosts, supernatural. My brother, I'm a twin, he was obsessed with it. And I wanted to go, and we went. And first of all, we went to Marble Arch Cinema, which was really, really modern. And they even had a stormtrooper in not alive, he never attacked anyone, in the actual foyer. And I remember we went, and I can't remember anything about, other than seeing it, I'm thinking, oh yeah, because my brother went up and touched the stormtrooper and he's like, don't do that. And that's what I remember about that. Then, where I lived was Battersea in the 70s, which again was all beautiful, very Victorian, really run down, very different to now. And there was the Granada, which had been, I have a feeling it would have been a theatre first of all. I might be wrong, but it was a theatre first of all, and then it was turned into a 1930s cinema. Like the facade was turned very modern. But inside, it was a real dream palace. So we had all these different areas and these big screens. And I remember we saw the film, we watched the film, and we told all our friends because we'd seen it. And all these children, like this huge, long line of children queuing up to see it. And we all went in, and the whole cinema was full. And rarely, they never ever let children up in the top balconies. It was always down. All these kids filled the thing. We all watched the film. And for anyone who hasn't seen, at the end, when the goodies win and they are being sort of the equivalent of knighted at the end, there is this sort of huge, it's a bit like sort of the scene with all the wild things with Max in Where the Wild Things Are. It sort of goes a bit mad, doesn't it? Everyone's sort of cheering, going like, hooray! And what happened, and I will never forget it, it'll probably be the last thing I see when I die, is there was a proscenium arch where the screen was.
Right.
And it was a really old Victorian cinema arch, and that image filled the cinema arch. And then everybody was cheering in the film, and it was like the end, like really powerful. And then every single child in that cinema, from the front row to the back of the balcony at the top, stood up, and you couldn't see where the film and the stage
That's brilliant.
Divided.
Yeah.
And so that for me was a moment when that made me interested in going to the theatre, of wanting to go, because when I grew up, demographically, you more so went to the cinema, you didn't go to the theatre. So there was a sort of lack of, not a lack of interest, but a lack of a way in. And I think when you have experiences like that, epiphanies like that, that is what makes you determined to do something. Or it gives you that sort of form. And I think as well, to link Brian in here, is that's the same with children's books. It gives children an opportunity, or it gives them a form of sort of confidence, or it forms a spell that it makes them fearless almost, or it gives them that sort of fearless nature. Méliès was known, he was sort of held up as a sort of first sci-fi director, wasn't he? So,
but what you experienced was the disappearance of that border between the audience and the art. And you experienced it literally, and that's an amazing story. I've never heard anything quite like that. But part of what you're describing, I think we've all experienced the feeling of that. And that and any great work of art will remove those borders so that the book becomes us, the play or the musical becomes us, or the movie becomes us. But that's a really extraordinary thing to have actually experienced.
Because it was the frame, wasn't it? Yeah. Within a frame, and then so for you,
the frame is broken.
Yeah, exactly. For you, designing for the theatre, creating that world, you're creating that division, aren't you, for the audience?
Well, not all the time. That's the thing. My first couple of years as a professional designer, I worked a lot at the Sheffield Crucible, which is a thrust stage.
Right.
So it has no proscenium, it has no frame. And then Michael and I moved to the Donmar Warehouse in London, and again, another thrust stage, very different size and shape to Sheffield, but again, a theatre without a frame. And it's only more recently that we started to work in the West End, in the old houses, the old more old-fashioned houses, where you have a proper proscenium.
Like a traditional, almost Pollux proscenium,
Yeah, exactly. And so each piece you do, everything you approach in a different location, a different venue, it constantly kind of reinvents the need to explore the nature of how you're telling that story. So not everything sits behind a frame. Because
I read, though, and I don't know, again, because it's the internet, is it right? With fake news, with Red, it was developed, or it was on a thrust stage, and it was all about the intimacy of the artist studio and the act of painting and his relationship with the assistant and everything. But then, didn't you prefer it to be behind a proscenium? Was that right or wrong?
No, I don't know where you read it, but that's absolutely right. It was at the Donmar, you were very much in the studio with the two of them making the work, which is a fascinating process, particularly when you could smell the terps and you get splattered with paint if you're not careful. But when you put it into a proscenium house and the thing becomes a painting behind a frame, ironically, Rothko paintings don't have frames, but you give it a frame by putting it behind the proscenium, and so you're invited to view the painting through the eyes of Rothko and his assistant in a way that isn't the same when it was at the Donmar. So it takes it one remove away, but actually I think you're right. Is a slightly better way of seeing.
Concentrates and makes it more intimate.
Yeah, you mentioned it earlier in the thing about a world within a world, and that's very much more a kind of case of how that would be.
Because that is the thing, isn't it? With the theatre, you go and you sit there, and it goes very dark, and then you concentrate on this sort of, not like television, or not like film in a way, because with film it's I don't know, it's slightly different, I suppose, because you do have those sort of elements of it being sort of behind glass, let's say, that you are sucked in, like you're there and you're sucked in, and like with Remy Charlip, it's like you sort of know that you're safe, but you want this thing, you can't stop it. And you yourself are sitting watching this thing sort of unfurl. Yeah. And there'll be a beginning, a middle, and an end. You want to get to the sort of end. You have to get to the end, and you will get to the end. And it's almost like a sort of funfair ride. If we go back to your childhood with the element of creativity, what kind of things interested you? I know we had a conversation a little bit earlier about train sets. Yeah. But you said it was a model making. What about with model making?
Yeah, I mean, I did, build these worlds for the train set, but also kind of just old school Airfix kits as well. And, I'm like a terrible 70s cliched British kid with Airfix kits hanging on bits of cotton off the ceiling and stuff.
Right, like, what was the famous one? Oh, the plane.
Spitfire.
No, Concorde.
Oh, Concorde.
Did you have Concorde?
Concorde had Spitfires. Had the work. But also I used to draw a lot. I still do draw a lot. Right. I just to doodle. I just would, a sheet of paper's not a sheet of paper until it's covered in irrelevant doodles and stuff. Right. So that was the thing that kept me kind of engaged all the time. Right. And I would draw on the furniture and stuff as well. I wasn't a good child.
I think that's good. That shows real creativity because you're pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, well, I guess aren't you? And my parents were very supportive, but they weren't really understanding necessarily. So it was sort of, they were kind of encouraging and without really knowing what they were encouraging.
Right. Please stop drawing on the furniture.
Yeah, exactly. only in my room, but it was just all over the desk and stuff like that.
Did you always want to be a set designer? Or
yes, I didn't want to be a book illustrator.
Right. So you didn't. No, but you didn't fall into it.
It was college. I knew I wanted to work three-dimensionally. That was the thing. I sort of, although I draw a lot, I'm not an accomplished draftsman, and certainly not in the league of Brian. So it's kind of like I like to draw, but I couldn't see myself making a career of it. So where I draw, it's in order to take it on to the next level of a process. And I like working with my hands. I like three-dimensional objects and stuff. And theatre seemed to be the ultimate expression of that, because it's actually four-dimensional, because it exists not only as a three-dimensional object, but over the course of an evening, over time.
Because
that's
exactly, that's the thing, isn't it? It's like it's both of you are sort of, your processes are multifaceted, and they're created by, well, let's say if you're creative, you can't always do multiple tasks.
Well, what's interesting is Christopher just said he draws in order to build things, and I build things in order to draw. So I make miniatures still, I make models, I make figures that can move, I make entire rooms in miniature,
right,
so that I can then make my drawings more realistic. So we're sort of working in these interesting parallel ways.
Yeah. But there'll be, see, for you, what has always fascinated me about set design, let's focus on that. You're making something, you're given this task, aren't you? You're sort of given someone else's vision, or you're allowed to have your part of a vision to create someone else's.
Yeah, it's your job to communicate a writer's ideas visually. And I mean, you talk specifically about set designing, but my job in the UK certainly is set costume and props to a greater or lesser extent. So you're creating the visual world completely. And it also, in America, it includes a lighting designer and sound designer too, that you are designers together. So you are all part of the same bracket, and you're all kind of putting together sort of thing. So I don't disassociate set design from lighting design, because you are how you're lit.
Yeah.
And that's, I design things with a view to working closely with several collaborators I work with a lot. I kind of think very much along the lines of, well, how would she approach the lighting of this space, and therefore I would put windows there or a gap there in order to allow this to sort of, to come alive.
So it's almost, I mean, it sounds a bit cliched, but it's almost, from my experience, because I trained I'd always wanted to be an illustrator, and my mathematics was crap. And I remember the very first day that I went into the class to do this module on illustration, you had to measure, I'll never forget it, and I hate them to stay for it, a Delft teapot. And you had to measure it and draw it. And I got up and I walked out. I thought, like, and I went down to the canteen.
Glad I didn't have to do that.
Yeah. But the description of the lighting, it's working with colour, isn't it? You have to control colour, and you have to be aware. So that is like the painting process. You have to be aware of, in some respects, a contained but much bigger picture, because you're having to think about the mood, how that colour reacts to people.
Oh, it's a much more complicated than that, because you're thinking about then costumes and how they fit, and how they work, and whether they look
that's just exactly,
or
that's just
whether the actor even likes what they're wearing, and whether they have an issue with that, and how it physically, can they do a cartwheel in it? And this is certainly doing musicals, doing period musicals. You've designed a beautiful ball gown, and the choreographer says, can they do a cartwheel in it? You sort of go, well, I mean, no, you can't do it.
Have you ever been tempted to say yeah?
Well, I mean, and it's on stage right now. But that's the thing, you then have to reinvent the ball gown in order to do the cartwheel. It's not reinventing the wheel, but it's like
reinventing the cartwheel.
Yeah, and that is the process. So all the period research in the world doesn't help you if you've got quick changes, and they've got the zips going right up the back and stuff, which they have to do because they're costumes, they're not historical reenactment.
So you can't. I mean, you only have a certain level where you can indulge yourself, because that's an important part of the creative process as well.
That's weirdly well put, actually. It's a very collaborative process, and you have to kind of negotiate with yourself about what you're willing to sacrifice in order to make the show work. You can turn around to a choreographer or a wig maker or someone and say, I know I want it to look like that, and that's how it is. But on the other hand, if you're working with the right people and you're on the same page, then you find a way of compromising it.
Right.
So, and it depends on what the project is. Obviously, Red as a piece was very naturalistic. It happened over real time, and they mixed real paints and worked in a real studio environment. Whereas doing a big musical like Frozen is obviously just an absolute fantasy fairy tale. So it's full of cheats.
Because we're going to come to that a little bit later. So with Reds, was it easier to manipulate those paintings? Because the star is a painting, or those paintings.
Yes.
So again, we go back to that frame within a frame.
The star of the design.
Yeah. It's fascinating, because the star of it for me was the narrative of it. The thing that blew my mind when I read the play, which was written by John Logan, who's how Brian and I met, was the nature of the relationship between the established artist and the young man who's his assistant, and how over the course of 5 acts, there's a very specific arc. There's a short scene, a longer scene, a big duet in the middle, then a short scene, and then a shorter scene.
Right.
And the arc of the play goes that the assistant arrives on the first day in the first scene and leaves in the last scene, and he leaves kind of as the master, leaving the artist alone in the room again, having kind of learnt more from his assistant than the assistant, as much as the assistant has learned from the artist. And that was a fascinating narrative for me, having been an assistant for a long time and worked with established designers and learned lots in the real world, and then finding myself in a position where I had assistants myself, and then how do you pass on knowledge, how do you pass on information? And it's one, it's the most precious thing in the world. And Brian talked about mentorship in his piece earlier, and it's like it's just vital, and it's so exciting and important that you can share knowledge and information and the people that want it. So that at the heart of Red is that relationship, which is what absolutely drove me to love it as much as I did. That also was the building of this studio, this detail with the research.
Yeah, because you then get also the audience are very privileged, because if you've never been into an artist studio, you can imagine it, and it is that thing of the physical sensation of smelling as well, isn't it? The sort of the colour and the smell.
Yeah.
That all has a flavour, it all has a feeling.
Yeah.
And what was interesting, I mean, I'm going to go slightly dark here, but it is a sort of childhood thing. Those paintings, when they were in the Tate, they were in their own room. They created this sort of experience. Yeah. And what they used to do, because our primary school did it, they took the children in and then they explained to them, which we won't talk about here, the dark history of those particular paintings, because they resonated with a great power, didn't they?
Yeah, and that's the thing. I, again, had as a child had been brought to London. I'd seen those paintings.
Yeah.
So when this play was,
they have a
presented,
theatrical element.
Totally. I mean, and he paints with frames. The kind of the shapes allude to frames within his canvases, without them being in any way representational. But I was very familiar with those paintings. So when this play came up, it was kind of fascinating to read about the backstory and that history, and to think that I'd had a relationship with them longer than I had a relationship with theatre, because it had been, like you said, school trips back in the day.
They were the sort of jewel in the crown of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's fascinating
Gallery,
that they'd ended up, up here in London as opposed to anywhere else.
Yeah.
They were a very important part of my love of the play.
Okay, if we now go on to another very successful, very important play, and particularly for us, and I suppose for Brian as well, because you know about Pollock Toy Theatre's Peter and Alice. And you told me that was the first time you saw a toy theatre, was the development of that play. Am I right or wrong?
No, it's a play again by John Logan, who wrote Red, coincidentally.
And there's another link between the two of you, of course.
And he posited a very brilliant idea that Alice Liddell, who was the model for Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Llewellyn-Davies, who was the model for Peter Pan, were both alive around about the same time, and apparently had met once. And no one knew.
And that was at Bumpus Bookshop.
At Bumpus Bookshop, a real place. So there was definitely historical documentation that this had happened, but no one knew what these two literary icons, or these iconic models, would have said to each other, obviously from different generations. So he posited this theory, this story. Both families were absolutely seeped in tragedy. All the brothers.
I know, it's incredibly sad, isn't it?
It's a brilliant discovery about these two people. So he has this story where you have the elderly Alice Liddell and the younger Peter Llewellyn-Davies. They're literally characters. So Peter Pan is a character, Alice in Wonderland is a character. They're writers. So Carol and
Barry.
Carol and Barry. Of characters too. So you had this kind of six-way conversation between fantastical characters, real-life people, and imagined authors.
This meeting, because I must just quickly point out, it's a bit of Pollock's trivia for the listeners. Bumpus Bookshop, George Spate, who was a toy theatre luminary after Pollock, he used to put plays on in Bumpus Bookshop.
And
so another link, another strange
I
moment.
found a black and white lithograph of one of those.
Oh, what, like one of the performances?
Yeah, one of those performances. So, and it purported to be a picture of Bumpus Bookshop with a toy theatre in it, a little so. So we built this naturalistic stockroom full of books, and props. And as these two characters interact with each other and talk to each other, they reminisce about their childhood, and the piece dissolves around them, and they find themselves inside a full-scale toy theatre, which I reinvented with characters from Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland. So that we've got the Duchess and Hook and stuff are all in the boxes, kind of observing the story. And because it leaps around the history from the battlefields of World War One to the Mermaid's Lagoon to Oxford and Hyde Park. So we use old-fashioned, paper cloths and stuff flying in and out in a properly old-fashioned toy theatre
Because
way.
that design aesthetic would have influenced, 2 generations leading up to that. So it's a very important, it's not just a theatrical prop, is it? It's a portal.
Yeah. Absolutely.
It shows itself as a portal into these imaginations, but more importantly, into the sort of cultural lives and the destinies, historical destinies of those children of the time.
Yeah. It was funny because John admitted to me afterwards that he always assumed it was just going to be video. In order to tell, in order to tell those different locations, he just figured there'd be a video screen in the back. It was so obvious to me that they could never be that. It had to be something physical and real and nostalgic and charming and beautiful. And he kind of bought it, obviously. Yeah, but it was.
Thank God for that. Thank God for you. Yeah.
But yes, it was interesting because the minute I read that play, I thought, well, this has to be within this world. That's kind of how it needs to read, and it does that great thing. It goes on a journey and then resets itself back in the bookshop at the end. But having gone on this amazing kind of story where the two characters are left kind of, contemplating what...
Yeah, their sort of childhoods.
Yeah.
And that, if we just sort of stay on the track for a moment of the childhood as being a sort of the fountain, for want of a better phrase, a fountain of sort of the beginning of creativity. He says a lovely thing. It's slightly sad. I'll read this one out first of all. Ben Whishaw in front of Pollock's Toy Theatre. The first time I saw the play, I saw Neverland come to life. It was real and it was so beautiful. So you have this sort of wonderful point, and that's what you do, isn't it? Tell us about Frozen.
Frozen, the Broadway musical, which is coming to London next year.
Because it will be at Drury Lane, won't it? It will be just
at
across the road from us.
Very good. It will be at Drury Lane, which is very exciting for me because obviously Drury Lane is one of, if not the most famous theatre in London, and it's a real privilege to have, to be able to work on that stage. We're also very lucky because they're spending the next year and a half renovating it, so they're going to do a lot of physical work to it to actually bring it up to speed as a sort of modern house as well. So which is fantastically useful for us in terms of how the building can work with us. It is a big project that I spent the last 2 years of my life
It's very big.
working on. It is very big, yes, it is very big. But it was a real privilege. It was a real thrill to be able to sort of do that. I'm a huge fan of animated movies and Disney movies in general. So when the phone call came, it was absolutely, I guess, a childhood sort of dream come true.
I would imagine, yeah.
Albeit one doesn't want to be kind of as coy as that, but it was kind of
Well, I think it is, isn't it? You've got to admit
it's a big deal, and it's a lot of responsibility. It's a lot of other people's money, but more importantly, it will be a gateway for a lot of people. It'll be the first show that a lot of kids see when they, that you only go to your first show once. And Frozen is very likely to be a lot of people's first show.
I absolutely agree.
And we were very aware that we had to both honour the movie itself, but also, bring something new to a stage adaptation.
This is the interesting thing. This is what I wanted to ask you. For us, for example, for us in the shop, we are always reinterpreting, and you do it as well as an illustrator and writer, Brian. One can afford to interpret or reinterpret ideas, especially where you have fairy tales. And Frozen is based loosely-ish on the Snow Queen, or we can sort of see elements of the Snow Queen.
It's the DNA in it.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of, so for example, for us, we always reinterpret different sort of fairy tales. We have it in our own products, so the shadow boxes. With that particular, let's say the Snow Queen fairy tale, we have a beautiful theatre made by the illustrator Kate Bailey. She was very influenced by the golden age of children's book illustration, all the famous like Rackham, people like that. But she was able to take elements from all these different people and utilise them. But for you, you're starting with something that is very recognised. Because the film, if we go back to your childhood, the film for 2 generations, and the same with the Harry Potter ones for you, Brian, is it's a Star Wars moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
And as for another generation, it was The Wizard of Oz. So you've got, both of you have had that sort of weight on your shoulders almost, but you can, you said it earlier in a sentence, you have to think about how you bring your own vision to it. How do you go about doing that?
Well, the truth is that I think people take for granted just how much work and effort and energy goes into making an animated movie. I think people kind of are a bit dismissive of it because they call them cartoons. And the truth is, as much research and development and hard work goes into the creation of those worlds. And they all start from the same place that we started from. You know, we went to Norway, and we actually went on the same trip that the Disney animators went on 10 years previously. So we saw the same churches, the same fjords, the same buildings. And you can see when you watch the movie how they interpreted them into...
Because they bought a real... What's the Sven is a... Reindeer, thank you.
Yeah.
They used a real reindeer, didn't they, for the movement and stuff
they always
like
have.
that.
I mean, they've always used real animals all the way back to Jungle Book and...
But no, but they're doing it in a time when, if like me, you're not very... if I'm honest, I can sneer at the sort of technical world. You know what I mean? I have my own fears and everything else. And I would think, they'll be able to do that really easily. They can just do blah, blah, blah.
There is nothing...
But they're... Right.
Nothing easy.
Nothing's easy.
Right. This is nice to know that people suffer.
They suffer, they love it. You know,
absolutely. This is the thing, isn't it? And this is what children should learn. And the thing with fairy tales, that you go over that glass mountain, in order to get something beautiful, you have to work for it. But don't be frightened of being compelled as a child, of having a compulsion.
I mean, we were very lucky because we went to the studio and met the animators who were actually in the middle of making the sequel. So although they'd made and parked the original movie, 5 years ago, they were still in the middle of a process of working with these characters again and re-examining, re-exploring, their motivation, stuff like that, which is what we were doing in the show as well.
Right.
But we have a longer running time. There's more music in the show. There's more character development in the show. There are great sequences that have changed and cut. There are characters that have been cut. There are the moments that have been sort of exaggerated and made bigger and stronger. And it's given Elsa a much stronger through line as well. Her screen time in the movie is remarkably brief. It's just that she has the big show-stopping sort of 6 o'clock number. But the bottom line is that, when you're placing it on stage with real actors in real performances, then you have to then readdress the balance of how they, how the evening responds to their personal growth and development over the course of the evening, being that they're not avatars in the same way that an animated character is. They are real people that bring real emotion and real, but also physicality to a piece as well, in terms of how much they can dance, how much they can sing, how many top C's you can hit in one night.
Will anyone be doing a cartwheel in a ball gown?
Yes.
Oh,
that was all spoken from.
That was experience. That was experience.
That was absolutely about experience. It's not fun. Well, yes, there is. Yes.
But with the visual look, let's say with the costumes, not only the sets, with the costumes. I mean, I would find, not being a costume designer, I'd find that very difficult. How do you go about then? Because you have to, obviously, that's recognisable. Those human beings in those clothes, represented by those costumes, they're recognisable. So are you allowed to sort of think, actually, I don't want that there now. I want her now to look like that?
Yeah.
Or
we absolutely, and this is the weird thing about it. People only see what they think they want to see.
That's interesting.
And I don't know how true this is, but I was told that Frozen was the first animated film that they actually had a costume designer working on the character costumes, because each of those looks is very iconic. Her coronation gown, certainly the ice dress.
Well, that's what everyone knows, even
Anna's
though I've never seen it, that
with
ice
the
dress,
purple cape and the blue skirt. They're very, very specific looks. You had to kind of do a squint test on it. You knew that if you kind of looked at it, you were seeing the same thing. But obviously on a real human being with real physicality, the shapes of it are all different, the proportions of it change and rebalance. And so, they are very different from just the drawings that are within the movie itself. But on the other hand, they still pay homage to that. But having said that, we change Elsa's look up completely in Act 2 in order to physically achieve what she needs to achieve, which is not more cartwheels.
That's a shame.
Anna gets a whole new look in Act 1 as well, because she has a different narrative journey that doesn't take her to the same places at the same time. So that, we shake things up a lot. The trolls are a whole different revisited look in terms of what they were in the movie as opposed to how they can be in the real world. Well, not in the real world, obviously, but on stage.
Well, no, she's the real world.
Which is the real world. It's better than the real world. Stage is better. So, yes, I mean, I think we were given a lot of freedom to do what we wanted, with a kind of acceptance and knowledge that we were hired to do this material. Don't be given Frozen and do Tangled. I mean, it's kind of like, you had to hit those beats, and you had the most famous song written in the last 10 years. You knew you had to deliver that in such a way. And so she has this big costume change in the middle of this magical costume reveal, which we knew we had to deliver on. So that that became a focus of the energy of the design process in terms of how do you deliver those beats and those moments. Same as Sven, the reindeer, and stuff like that. You wanted something that was truly awe-inspiring, and the kids who look at it go, how does it work? Literally, they can't conceive of how this thing works because it's so beautiful, such an incredible achievement of puppetry. So that stuff is good for me because it challenges you, allows you to be challenged. That's the thing. And also, Norway is a world that isn't explored very often. It's sort of like it has its own unique visual identity, and in terms of the materials they use and their local dress, which they call bunad. So it's not something that you see all the time. So you research that and you discover about that. It's a fascinating world that you go. It's another rabbit hole. Like all design.
Yeah, it's not cut off, but it's independent.
Yeah, it's this whole separate world, and yet then you have to fit it into the real world of actually their costumes, not historical reenactment. And it seems like their shoulders are cut very loose and very square, and they look very odd when you put them on a modern body sort of thing. So you end up cheating it back to where you expect it to be.
Yeah, so you are manipulating in a way.
Yeah, you're cheating. You cheat to tell the truth on stage.
But that's creativity as well, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's literally what it's about. Everything on stage is fake. Every picture behind a frame is fake. But you're telling a truth, and that's my job. And we were very, very adamant when we did this. We built a frame for Frozen. It's a big carved wooden frame, and every scene in the show is a full-scale picture. Everything fills.
So we go
frame.
back to the frame.
Yeah, it's definitely a picture book telling of this story. So that the castle fills that frame. The oak fills that frame. Nothing's a little kind of small-scale thing in the corner. It all becomes big pictures, so that you could then take each scene out, and you've got the coronation, or you've got the garden, or the ice palace, and all these sort of things, and they all exist as full-stage pictures.
And for the children watching it, those are fragmented memories.
Yeah, that was the idea, that sort of everything you have a visual memory of that scene because it was framed by that with a big moon and the wisteria hanging in front of it and girl doing a cartwheel. Yeah, so that was very much my way in to doing the design of the piece.
Brilliant. A question for both, but I'm going to ask Christopher first because he is in the queue at the moment. No, it's all right. It's all right. Don't panic, everyone. Right. How important? I mean, you can both join in. How important? Okay, I'll ask you both. How important are encouraging children to play and explore their creativity for their futures? In the digital age, how important is it that children look at books, go to plays, learn to make things?
You said this was going to be an easy question.
It is.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's pretty amazing that given the digital world that we live in, children's books as objects still sell very strongly. Parents want their children to hold the physical object, to turn the page, to have a relationship to something, that does one thing. A book does one thing. It tells a story, and it gives you a relationship. And I'm not anti-technology. I think it's amazing that we have these little miracles in our pockets that can answer questions and that can entertain us. And I don't think it's bad for kids. But I do think that what we've all been talking about is the importance of remembering that we do need to do things. We do need to use our hands. We need to be able to create these worlds. And I feel like, we're very lucky in that we've been able to make a career out of this love of making things and of creating worlds.
Yeah, I agree.
Because we had a secret conversation, didn't we? And you were saying about the split between you working on the laptop and enjoying drawing in your sketchbooks, and we're saying about having sketchbooks and finding sketchbooks, and I said to you about when you find a sketchbook, it's almost like you find a relic, like it's almost like a religious thing. So for you, Christopher, physically drawing, going right back to when you were at college or when you were a child, it's the same enjoyment, isn't it? It's as important to the process.
I recently got involved with an iPad, and it's not a happy relationship. And I'm sort of trying to wean myself back off it in order to get back into paper and pencil.
But you go to Pollock's, like you walk into Pollock's, and that's what we're all reminded of. We're all reminded of the
Our
importance.
work here is done. That's what I wanted to. You're both free. You're free to go. You can leave the court.
Well, that's what Pollock's does for everybody. It
Oh,
gives us
wonderful.
that gift.
Well, Brian, Christopher, thank you. It's been a wonderful episode. It's been an absolute thrill.
It's been really fun to talk to you.
Okay, now
Thank you.
you'll have to move to one side because I've got to tidy up the finger frights now. Thank you.
Thank you.
very much indeed.
Okay, next customer, please. Thanks for listening to Holding Up the Queue. These podcasts are created by Benjamin Pollock's Toy Shop in Covent Garden and the heart of London Theatreland for over 80 years. Find out more about Benjamin Pollock's by visiting our website, pollocks-coventgarden.co.uk. Follow us on Twitter at Pollock's Toy Shop and join the conversation at #HoldingUpTheQueue.